Thank you for having me. It's really nice to see that there are so many people. I think it's around 70 people right now interested in this topic. Yeah, so the title is a bit long, right? The individual lay listener as a variable in speaker discrimination tasks. So the idea is this research is about enhancing the reliability of ear-witness testimony. And we're sort of doing it by not improving the voice parade, which is already an existing measure of doing it, but we rather see how well the individual listener is actually suited for this sort of tool, for the voice parade. Yeah, so just a disclaimer, you can here see the logo of Saarlandes University, right? This is my current affiliation. Yeah, and as Omnia said in her flattering introduction, I'm a lecturer here now. All of the research I'm presenting here today is actually part of my PhD work, and that was conducted at the University of York, so actually not here. And that work was supervised by Paul Fowkes, who's also the co-author of a paper which actually has the same title as this presentation. So the paper is also called The Individual Lay Listener as a Variable in Speaker Discrimination Tasks. You'll also see it on the reference list later on. But this talk goes a bit beyond it. So I'm actually also including some unpublished stuff in here. And I also provide you with a bit of a more detailed background on ear-witness testimony in general. So let's have a look at, I sort of have to try to minimize this because I can't figure out how to change the slides. Okay, it's working. So ear-witness testimony plays a sort of special role within forensic speech sciences. By the way, I will say forensic speech science, you can also call it forensic phonetics or anything in that sort of direction. So I will use forensic speech science throughout. And ear-witness testimony plays a sort of special role within forensic phonetics. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. Then I will talk about the voice parade procedure in the way we have it at the moment. Please note I can only talk about the United Kingdom and Germany because that is the legislations that I'm familiar with. It might be slightly different in Egypt, but I'm sure that you have the same sort of procedure in principle as well. Then I talk about existing research on ear-witness testimony. So that is basically everything that has already been done. You will see that that falls in one of two camps predominantly. So depending on the variable that they look at, I'm going to give you like a detailed summary of the existing research. And then I'm already sort of foreshadowing what the problems with the voice parade procedure might be. So I think there is a sort of research gap and that the existing research misses one type of variable that hasn't really been investigated yet. And then my own study will basically try to address that gap. So my own study will look at the individual witness as a variable in this sort of voice parade task. Okay. So let's start by having a closer look at ear-witness testimony within forensic speech science. It's important to keep in mind that in actual casework, about 90% of the cases we have, maybe even more, actually involve the comparison of recordings. So that is the traditional speaker comparison sort of task. You usually have a question sample and a known sample. So the question sample would be a recording of, for instance, the perpetrator at the criminal event. The known sample would be a recording from a suspect, and you usually want to compare them. I don't have a reference for this number of 90%. That is just what I found out by talking to people who work in the field. So they all end up at around this sort of percentage when they talk about their own casework. Yeah, and we can actually say that the expert's task in this case is to compare these two files, these two recordings, and determine if the differences that we have between them, and there will always be differences, right? Because you can't, even the same speaker can't say the same thing exactly in the same way twice. So the expert basically wants to find out if all of the differences can be attributed to within speaker variability. That's usually the prosecution hypothesis, because that is often the incriminating finding. Or the other way around, the defense's hypothesis that all of the differences we find are actually attributable to between speaker variability. Please note that this is not an identification per se, it's rather an individualization We can talk about the difference in detail maybe afterwards if there are any questions. I'm just going to give you a brief summary. So the idea is that an object can only be identical with itself in the narrowest sense of the word. That is not the case for two recordings. So two recordings will be inevitably different from each other in some aspects. So the actual task we have here is an individualization task, and that means to find out whether two traces are produced by the same source. So that's just as a side note, I will use the term individualization throughout. Colloquially, it's often referred to as identification. So let's have a look at ear-witness testimony itself within forensic speech science. I said it has a sort of special role, and that is because we would only ever consider ear-witness testimony at all if we don't have a recorded question sample. So at least that is the case in the United Kingdom. So whenever we have a recording, we would actually prefer having the expert compare the two recordings. If we don't have that option, we would basically have to rely on an ear witness. And that is someone who has observed the criminal event, maybe was involved in some aspect, and who's memorized the question sample. So we sort of use that ear witness's memory as a conduit for the question sample. And then we have to provide some sort of framework in which the ear witness can compare their memory to a known sample that we have. So that will still be a recording from a suspect, for instance, from a police interview, something like that. Obviously, multiple variables have a bearing on the reliability of such ear witness testimony. So, for instance, one of them that is crucial is the familiarity with a questioned speaker. You will all know that it is much easier to recognize a familiar person's voice than an unfamiliar person's voice. Also, the delay after which the ear witness testimony is being elicited. And there is a lot of research done there in the early days by Frances McGehee, who, that's the reference down there. She got two publications out in 1937 and 1944, so it was quite early. And that was a direct reaction to the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby, which was a very famous case around that time. And some dodgy ear witness testimony played a great role in this case. So actually, Charles Lindbergh was the witness and said he could identify the perpetrator's voice as late as 2 years after he had heard that voice for the only time during the crime. And he actually only overheard one single sentence being spoken by the perpetrator. So that is, of course, that raised some eyebrows, right? And Frances McGehee, she was one of the pioneers of ear witness research, and she did a whole array of tests on various aspects. The most reliable information we have from her research is about the memory decay of the witness. So you will see that we have basically a steady decline of memory. It's exponential, the decline. And it's already very, very low and unreliable only 2 weeks after the encounter with the perpetrator, if it's an unfamiliar speaker. So that just to keep in mind. We have to take other findings by McGee with a grain of salt, because we wouldn't exactly do it the same way today with sort of modern testing methods. So some of the variables she tested, there were cases where she tested multiple variables in the same experiment, and we can't really find out which independent variable is actually having an impact on which dependent variable. But the data she has on memory decay are very reliable and still quite accurate today. Potentially, the age of the witness also plays a role. So that is something that psychologists are very much interested in, and whether we identify certain age groups of speakers better than other age groups. Also, the sex or gender of the witness in combination with the sex or gender of the speaker. So there is this sort of hypothesis that you might be better at identifying voices from your own sex than other voices. So that women are better at identifying female voices, men better at identifying male voices. So that is also something that psychologists are very much interested in. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list of factors that we can have, right? So there is a huge array of variables that influence the reliability of ear witnesses. We're going to see a few more later on. And the sort of framework we have to test that reliability is the so-called voice parade. So the voice parade, you can also call it a lineup in American English. That is basically the same that you have for eyewitness identifications, or better, individualizations. So you have a known sample, which is from the suspect, and you have 8 foil voices. Those are distractor voices against which the witness can judge the sample of the suspect. It's 8 voices in the UK, I think in Germany as well. I'm not sure how it would work in Egypt, but I think you will also have a fair number of sort of distractor voices. So why do we do that? The entire idea is we want to manipulate the prior odds. So we just want to make it very unlikely that if someone who's randomly guessing will pick the suspect, because there is only a chance of 1 in 9 that that will happen. In the UK, this sort of procedure is standardized by the Home Office. So that's now 20 years old, a set of guidelines. And that is in turn based on the so-called Macfarlane guidelines that Professor Francis Nolan from the University of Cambridge came up with in collaboration with a police officer who goes by the name of Macfarlane, so the so-called Macfarlane guidelines. There was a barrister, however, who's called Jeremy Robson, also working together with people in Cambridge. And in 2016, he did a survey on the use of voice parades in the United Kingdom. And what he found out is actually that they are very sparingly used. So people almost never use these voice parades in real life. I think he asked 43 police forces who had used the procedure in the past decade, so 10 years, and only less than 10% of them indicated that they had used that procedure in that period of time. And that is because in the past, this has proven notoriously difficult. So very often you get cases where an individualization is made in the voice parade, but still the evidence gets dismissed in court for several reasons. People don't really trust the procedure, and it's a sort of a tricky topic. So if we have a look at the research that's being done to address the issues with voice parades, we can sort of find 2 general movements. And the first movement is a sort of, it's a little bit older, this research, so that was conducted in the 80s and 90s up until the early 2000s. And they wanted to find out more about the circumstances of the crime. We can call these type of variables, we can call this estimator variables. This is a distinction made by Gary Wells in 1978. And this is the idea that estimator variables can't really be influenced by the investigator. They can only be estimated. So therefore, estimator variables. That would be something like the delay between the exposure and identification. So that was already done in the 1930s by McGee, if you remember. But also the familiarity with the question speaker, or something like this Hammersley and Reed paper, where they had a look at whether active and passive exposure to the voice at the crime scene makes a difference. So whether the witness actually conversed with the perpetrator, or whether the witness was merely like a bystander and had some passive input from that voice. Unsurprisingly, they found out that having an active conversation with the perpetrator drastically improved the reliability of the testimony. Also, something like the number of voices present at the crime scene, we would call it speaker diarization, if we want to find out how many voices there are in a conversation. And again, it might be quite trickier to single out the perpetrator from a group of speakers than just having a one-on-one interaction between the witness and the perpetrator. So all of these variables can't really be influenced by the person who is leading the investigation. The second movement then had a look at the things that can be manipulated by the investigator, and we sort of call these system variables because of that. So that's the other big group of variables. And that is really to do with the voice parade itself. So what sort of stimuli do we use in the voice parade? What type of speech is used for these? So for instance, do we use read speech or spontaneous speech? Is there any background noise? So sort of sound quality is always very important in forensic work. Then the duration of the stimuli. So how long do they have to be to get a sort of reliable response? How long, or is there like some point where the length actually becomes a disadvantage if the recordings are too long and we get some sort of memory overload? Also, if we have a difference depending on whether there is audio and visual information, so whether you see the perpetrator and hear the perpetrator or just hear the voice. So if someone is wearing a mask, for instance. And then some quite interesting experiment has also been done with different modes of presentation for the stimuli. So in the usual voice parade, you present all of the voices and then you elicit one single judgment, and that would be the serial presentation. But in a sequential parade, you would actually have each speaker, and after each speaker elicit a judgment by the witness. So you would actually get, in this case, in the UK, you would get 9 individual judgments, getting a bit more data points. Right, so that is the two big movements that we have. What we can say here is that all of these efforts try to improve the credibility of the voice parade procedure. They basically just want to make sure they find the sweet spot for the settings of the voice parade. The question that I'm asking is a bit different. So I'm asking, how can we actually establish credibility in the witness? For instance, can we find out whether the individual witness is good or bad at this sort of task in general? And that would obviously help a judge establish what weight they would give the voice parade evidence. I've already sort of foreshadowed this. So one problem with the voice parade is that you only get one single data point per witness. You get just one rating, so the witness will pick someone, and the question is then what sort of what can the underlying result be? And if you have a look at this table down here, you can see that if the suspect is guilty and the witness selects the suspect, we get a hit. That is actually what we would want. That's the desired outcome. A problem would be, however, if the suspect is innocent and the witness selects the suspect, because in that case we get a false alarm. So that would even work despite the problem with the prior odds. The investigator can't know if we have a hit or a false alarm because the investigator themselves does not know whether the suspect is guilty or innocent. We can observe, however, the witness making a mistake if the witness selects a foil voice, because the identity of those speakers is known. So we can actually identify a scenario where the witness makes a mistake. And that is sort of the problem in a nutshell, that the witness can be observed making an incorrect choice, but we can't really observe the witness making a correct choice, because that is actually something that we want to find out from the witness, whether the suspect is guilty or innocent. Okay, it's really tricky to change the slides here. So I just want to show you again how this is actually some sort of circular reasoning in essence, because the voice parade, as I've just described it, has two functions in a way. One function is to test the suspect. So we want to test the suspect in terms of whether the suspect was present or absent at the crime scene. At the same time, we want to assess the witness, however, and find out if the witness is reliable, because the witness can sort of fail the parade. So we have one single test that is assessing both the suspect and the witness. So we first of all want to establish that the witness is credible, and then the witness themselves become a test for the suspect. So that is the sort of circular reasoning that we're in. So my proposal would be that we separate these two functions of the voice parade and have the voice parade itself in the way it's already existing, and then have an additional screening test that can provide us with additional information on the witness's reliability. So what sort of variables would this screening test look at? If we have a look at the estimator and system variables again, I've just created this table. This is actually from my PhD thesis. So the two columns on the left-hand side, that is a traditional classification between system variables and estimator variables. Everything that is a system variable can be controlled. Everything that's an estimator variable cannot be controlled. I now further subdivided estimator variables into event variables, so variables relating to the crime scene and variables relating to the witness. And the variables relating to the witness, that is where there is really a research gap. So we don't have many people who actually want to see how different the individual listeners are from each other. And the ones highlighted in gray, those are basically the variables that I did experiments on myself. I'm just presenting the first one of these experiments in this talk today, because I think otherwise it would get a bit too long. And one of those variables is basically voice discrimination capabilities. So how capable is the listener of distinguishing between two voices? Then voicing memory capabilities, that would be how long can the witness retain a memory of that impression? And lastly, task awareness of the witness during the crime. So that is the idea that was the witness aware during the crime that memorizing the voice would actually be something useful? And in most cases, that is not the case, right? So I just wanted to find out if we get the occasional witness who actually was aware that this might be an important thing to do, will we get any different results from other people? So if I'm comparing the sort of voice parade as it exists with a complementary test that I have in mind, and we compare them side by side, we can see that the function of the voice parade is to obtain evidence, as it already does, and then the complementary screening test would be basically to establish the weight of that evidence. We can also say that the voice parade is designed for every witness in theory, but de facto it is not. De facto it is created for the average witness, because all of the research on estimator variables and voice parade improvement, they had a look at the settings that worked for the average listener. And that's what they took forward, which is a reasonable thing to do, right? You want to make sure that the majority of people get a good result from the voice parade. But in theory, we are excluding some people, right? Because we're just taking the average listener performance and create the voice parade for that. The screening test, on the other hand, is for every witness. So we actually find out something about each individual listener. One big improvement would be that in such a complementary screening test, we can have many judgments. So we don't just have the one pick from the voice parade, but we actually can have multiple trials. So my experiment was like 30 something trials of yes, no judgment or same, different judgments, which means we get a much better idea of the accuracy. We can actually give that person an accuracy in terms of a percentage. And we also find out something about the correlation between confidence and accuracy, which is something that the voice parade can't do at all. We also find out something about witness behavior. So does that witness have a certain bias? Do they tend to say it's a different voice or tend to say it's the same voice? So do they have a certain general tendency towards one of the answers? Basically, that translates to how conservative or how courageous is that listener in their judgments. So that is basically the two functions of these screening tests. Right, so the present study, that basically is the first step towards such a screening test. Keep in mind, it can't obviously be, since this is the very first study in this sort of realm, it can't be a fully fledged screening test, right? Because there are so many variables that we could control for in such a test. So what I've tried to do with this experiment, which is the first one, is establish a baseline for further experiments on the topic. And because of that, I chose settings which are sort of the minimal, it's the minimal difficulty that you can have. So in terms of audio quality, I chose files with a very good audio quality, which might not be forensically realistic, but I just want to sort of have a look at the simplest scenario that you can have. I also reduced memory to a minimum. So basically, this is really about voice discrimination. The listeners will hear files and judge them directly against each other. The underlying idea is that if we find differences at this very simple test, we can then gradually build up complexity in the further tests, make them more and more difficult, and actually see what variables we can further manipulate to get an even better discrimination result from this sort of screening test. This all is taken inspiration from voice processing tests that had been done by psychologists. So there is the Glasgow voice memory test, for instance, the Bangor voice matching test, and the Jena voice learning and memory test. So those are the most prevalent and most successful tests that we have. They have some problems though when it comes to forensic reliability or applicability, because the stimuli that they chose are essentially too short for a forensic comparison. So the Glasgow voice memory test, they use stimuli of just the phoneme E being produced by the speakers. The Bangor voice matching test uses syllables in isolation. So something like consonant, or vowel, consonant, vowel, different syllables. All of these stimuli are shorter than a second in length. So that is highly problematic from a forensic point of view. And the Jena test, they use pseudo-speech. So basically speech that is semantically void with nonsense words. It adheres to the phonotactics of English, so it is somewhat realistic, but we can't really say that this is naturalistic speech. And we want to work with naturalistic speech in a forensic scenario. We have to keep in mind that these psychological tests actually had a different purpose. So they were to test whether people are potentially patients that have phonognosia. So it was to establish whether a patient has some certain type of voice recognition disability. On the other hand, the other end of the spectrum would be a super recognizer, which is a bit of a hyped term at the moment. So there are many studies looking into voice super recognition. Two of these tests didn't find any super recognizers. So the Glasgow and the Bangor test didn't find any. The Jena test found some, but again, we only have this information for the non-naturalistic speech stimuli. So I'm doing something similar here. It's actually similar to the Bangor voice matching test because that was also a discrimination task. And what I'm doing is I took stimuli from the DIVERS database, which is a sort of database of fake police interviews. And that is very forensically realistic because you would actually take the stimuli of a voice parade from other police interviews from unrelated cases. So this is very realistic in terms of the forensic applicability. And I took two 10-second long extracts from 48 of the DIVERS speakers. There are 100 speakers in the corpus in total. So one for the exposure and one for the subsequent recognition. And all of these stimuli had at least 7 seconds of net speech. So that is substantially more than the less than 1 second, 500 milliseconds we get from, for instance, the Glasgow test. It's also culturally controlled. So all of the DIVERS speakers are male and aged between 18 and 25. So we have a sort of control for the cultural dimension of voice variability as well. And then I manipulated all of the files a bit to make sure that they have the same sound quality. So they were all normalized in terms of volume, converted from stereo to mono, so that people couldn't really pick out a speaker just because of the recording quality. I'm trying to share some of the actual stimuli used in the experiment. I think it should work. So first speaker here, speaker 20 from the DIVERS corpus with a mean of 94 hertz. And I always have 2 recordings, so one for the exposure and one for the later recognition.
It's one of the new type of VW Beetles, which is it's a nice sky blue coloured car.
Right, so this is the first recording from that speaker.
Past the steakhouse, well, there's a turning in that leads to the Pear Tree Court Apartments, and I think that's quite near the Baxter's sports ground.
That's the second recording from that speaker. Speaker 10 now is reasonably higher in the average hertz in terms of F0. So let's listen to that. That's 128 hertz, one of the highest pitch voices in the test. Oh, sorry.
And there's Eugene Burke. He's a barber. He's my supervisor. He lives in he lives in Dexter, and we're often out playing sports together out.
So quite a bit higher. And then the last speaker, 120. This is one of the lowest pitch speakers.
Well, I got home just before 6, so I watched the news first, then caught up with soap, and then just caught the end of a film before I went to my sister's.
So you might hear they all have a sort of the same Southern British accent. If we now compare, however, the speaker with the 94 hertz to the speaker with the 84 hertz, you might see that this is actually a tricky task already to tell these speakers apart, although we have a difference of 10 hertz between them. So again, I'm playing speaker 20, the first exposure sample.
It's one of the new type of VW Beetles, which is it's a nice sky blue coloured car.
And now compare that to speaker 120.
It must be a mistake. I mean, my sister quite often borrows my car to go on journeys, so it could have been her giving a friend a lift. But I definitely did not have a guest in the car on Thursday.
So I think they already sound quite the same. If you now imagine that you even have a delay between hearing that first voice and the second voice, you can see that many people might wrongfully tell them together, although there are different speakers. So that's the stimuli that I used. In terms of the test design, again, we have this AX discrimination task, which was hosted online on Pavlovia. So we have an immediate judgment, stimulus 1, a very short interruption of 10 seconds, and then stimulus 2. I had 96 pairs in total created from the 48 speakers, so 96 unique pairs, and I sort of tried to establish how difficult that pair might be in terms of the F0 difference between both recordings in a pair. I then, as a sort of proof of concept, created 3 different stimulus lists. So they are all created in terms of the same principle, right? So we have basically the same number of easy, the same number of medium, the same number of hard pairs in there, 32 pairs per list, and 50% of them being same speaker pairs, 50% being different speaker pairs. And those lists were randomized for each participant. So essentially each participant got their own randomized test. Also, because this was supposed to be a very easy task, the participants were aware of the task here. So they know exactly that this was a voice recognition test. They then provided the same different rating for each pair after having heard both voices. So it just said this is the same speaker in both files or a different speaker. And then they also reported their confidence, overall confidence, by the way, at the end of the test on a 6-point scale. We measured reaction times. This is something that I should mention. I'm not sure. Yeah, we measured reaction times as well. This is something that hasn't really been done in terms of earwitness testimony. And it was a bit of a shot in the dark. So I just thought it would be nice to see if something that can't really be controlled by the listener, something like the reaction time, actually tells us something about accuracy. So this is sort of a first in terms of earwitness experiments. And those are the participants that took part in the test. You see, this is already color-coded in terms of accuracy and age of the participants. We're going to get to that later. So right now, I just want to show you the distribution of people all over the UK. So we really got people from very different places all over the country, essentially. 100 people altogether, 50% of them are male, 50% female. We actually wanted to make sure we have a very balanced sample here. Minimal age was 18 years. That was also the minimal age you could have to take part in the experiment. Maximum age 68 years and a median age of 36 years. And we tried to get very close to the average population median age, which is 40.7 years according to the last census. If we now have a look at the results, we actually see that our own test, I have to see if I actually color-coded this. No, sorry, I didn't. So our own test, which is the upper pane here, has, in terms of accuracy, a minimum accuracy of 50%. So that is basically guessing. That is chance likelihood. And the maximum accuracy of 93.75%. The mean accuracy being exactly between 50 and 100%, so at 75%, which is actually showing us that the test is very well calibrated. And the fact that we have 93.75 as the maximum percentage means that we don't reach a ceiling. If you have a look at the Glasgow voice memory test, for instance, the maximum performance there was 100%. That kind of shows us that people could eventually, they could also be much better than the 100%. It's just that 100% is the ceiling of the test. So the test can't actually capture the entire span of latent ability that we might have. If we compare that to the Bangor voice matching test, which was also a discrimination task, we see that here they get much closer to the 100% in terms of maximum accuracy. By the way, PC is percent correct, right? So that is the accuracy measure. And they have a very narrow span of results. So everything between 61 and 97% and a mean of 84%. So it's slightly skewed, right? Most people do better than the exact midpoint between these two numbers. Okay, I also calculated the D prime, which is something that the Bangor voice matching test does not provide us with. D prime is basically taking into account all of the possible outcomes of the voice parade. So the hits, the false alarms, the correct rejections, and the misses. And that shows us something about listener discriminability. We have a D prime here between 0 for our test and 2.94, and 3.0 would be basically perfect discriminability. So our test is actually very good at discriminating between different performances. You see that the Glasgow voice memory test is actually going beyond 3 in terms of maximum D prime. That is something we don't really want. So we want the D prime to be at around 3 or lower. We also found super recognizers. And this was kind of surprising to me because I didn't want to find super recognizers. They're sort of a byproduct here. And this is actually the first test that found super recognizers with naturalistic stimuli. So we found two of them, two super recognizers. They had more than 92.94% correct. So that is 2 standard deviations above the mean performance. And we found 4 people at the opposite end of the spectrum. So they had a percentage correct lower than 57%. I always had this sort of pattern across all of my experiments that there were more people at the lower end of the spectrum than at the upper end of the spectrum. So that might be a trend. I haven't really looked into that, but just something I wanted to mention. Okay, let's now have a look at the results. Again, this is just a summary slide where I've already said all of this. So again, in case I can share the slides afterwards, in case you want to sort of listen to that again, what I've just said, you can read it up here. Let's have an actual look at the stimulus lists, because that was the sort of proof of concept, right? I had 3 stimulus lists created in the same manner. And actually, this shows that we really had the sort of same result from all of these stimulus lists. So all of them had a mean performance around 75%. They were highly comparable, and some rash models. So that is something you can do in terms of item detection theory. You can actually see that all of them had measured around 90% of the participants' latent ability, which is quite a high number. All of the lists were also normally distributed. So that really shows that F0 as a sort of means of item difficulty works really well. I can show you the distributions on the next slide. They might look a bit skewed for stimulus list A, but that is just because we had fewer people take stimulus list A. So we didn't have, out of the 100, we didn't really have 33, 33, 34 or something like that. We really had much fewer participants for stimulus list A. But all of the normality tests that we conducted showed us that the data is actually normally distributed in all of these stimulus lists. We then did a further statistical analysis in terms of a generalized mixed effects model and used R for that. So we used the LME4 package. And here we again wanted to find out what explanatory variables we might be able to find for participant accuracy. So the accuracy of the response, so if it's a correct response or not, that was the dependent variable. And then the fixed effects we wanted to have a look at was participant age, participant sex, the reaction times, of course, the F0 difference between the voices in a pair, so that was a difficulty measure, the trial number of the item inside the test, so how early in the test the item came up, and the confidence rating. And we clustered all of these in terms of participant identity. So we just took the participant's ID number in the experiment as a clustering variable. The results here show that we had no significant effect of age, sex, or confidence. So that is also something that we were sort of expecting, because other experiments have really struggled to find an effect of these things. So listener age, listener sex, listener confidence did not really give us any information about accuracy. However, reaction time was a highly significant effect. And I can show you, I didn't include the effect size on here. I'm just giving you a p-value because I've visualized the effect size in terms of a probability curve in the next slides. We also found a highly significant effect of trial number and of zero difference between items in a pair. So this is what it looks like for the reaction times. You can see that the probability of a correct response is declining the longer people take to answer that item. So essentially, the faster you make a judgment, the more likely it is to be correct in this sort of test. This was the strongest effect. You can see it's ranging from between around 80% to like just below 25%. So this had a huge impact, reaction time. Also, the trials number, so where in a test the item appeared, that had also a highly significant effect. And you can see the probability of a correct response is declining the later the item appeared in the test. So that might lead us to believe that this might be some sort of fatigue effect, right? So people will have had they will have gone through a lot of mental effort until they get to a later stage in the experiment. It could also be a memory effect, that people have heard a lot of voices by the time they get to the end of the experiment, and that might sort of cloud their memory for the specific voice in the item. You see, however, that this effect is much smaller than the previous one, right? So have a look at the Y scale here. Basically, it's between 70 and 80% that difference. So it is measurable, but it is a marginal effect compared to the reaction times effect. And the last thing is the effect of F0. And this was a bit trickier because F0 is, of course, expected to have a different effect on same speaker pairs and different speaker pairs. Because the idea is if you have a small F0 difference, it will be much easier to tell recordings together. And if you have a greater F0 difference, it will be expected to be used to tell speakers apart. So we actually ran the model again, and this time the independent variable was not the percentage correct, but rather the false alarms and the misses. So we sort of split up that model for different speaker and same speaker pairs. And you can see again that the probability of a false identification, of a false alarm, is essentially lowering as F0 difference gets greater, and the probability of a miss is increasing as the F0 difference gets greater. So that's exactly the adverse effect that we were expecting. And that's showing us nicely that F0 is actually quite a key variable in determining speaker similarity. So just to conclude, I think the test shows that lay listeners differ tremendously in their ability to recognize voices. We also showed that F0 is a key measure of voice difficulty, which, I mean, there is a lot of other literature to back that up. Metadata like participant age and sex are not good predictors for voice recognition skills. So actually, one of the super recognizers we found was I think a 56-year-old woman, and the other one was a 24-year-old man. So we can actually say age and sex are not good predictors for your ability to discriminate between voices. It's rather like your individual capability. Participant behavior, on the other hand, above all the reaction time, might be a promising predictor for future research into earwitness testimony. So as I said before, this hasn't been done yet. And I think it might also be feasible to have this sort of screening test, because this experiment could show that people are very different in their capabilities. And if we can assess their overall capabilities and give that to a judge as an additional means of evaluating a voice braid outcome, that might be very helpful. So yeah, that's the end of my talk. I think this was about 45 minutes. And I'm also giving you the references now. By the way, a bit of an advertisement in my own favor. So my own PhD thesis and my latest paper are on here as well. So in that latest paper towards a screening test for earwitnesses, that is actually partially talking about the results that I've just presented here, in case you want to read up on it.